Welcome, everybody, to this episode of Bright Blue TV, where we ask Rwanda, deterrent or disastrous? The number of asylum seekers crossing the channel doing dangerous journeys has been rising again in recent years. And as a result of this, earlier this year, the Home Secretary announced the UK-Rwanda Migration and Economic Development Partnership. As part of that, the UK government is providing funding for 5 years for Rwanda to take asylum seekers that arrive instantly in the UK for their claims to be processed in Rwanda. And the funding covers both the processing and the integration support that Rwanda needs. Last month, the first asylum seekers were due to leave to Rwanda, but the plane was grounded very controversially at the last minute after a series of legal challenges. And in fact, the European Court of Human Rights determined that before a plane was allowed to take off, the policy had to be deemed legal first. We shall find that out very soon because the UK courts are judging a case at the moment to determine whether it is indeed legal to do so. And we're seeing in this Conservative Party leadership race that the candidates are committed to this Rwanda policy. In fact, there's even been calls to expand it to other countries. So we've got a great panel with us today to explore whether this policy is going to be effective or not and popular. For those of you who are following on Twitter, please use the hashtag BBTV. And you get an opportunity to ask questions as well to the panelists, and you can do that via Slido. So under the YouTube video that you're watching at the moment, there's a link to Slido. So please do ask questions through that. Tell us who you are and where you're from and your question. So the panel today, we have Bella Sankey, who is the Director of Detention Action, Alp Mehmet, who is the Chair of Migration Watch, and Professor Maria Sobolewska, who is the Professor of Political Science at the University of Manchester. So we'll start with you, Bella. You know, there's obviously been a problem with the number of people making dangerous journeys across the channel, and that's been growing in recent times. If Rwanda's not going to work, what will? You're muted at the moment, Bella, so if you could come off mute.
Apologies. Thanks, Ryan, for the invitation to join you today. I'm really delighted to be here with Bright Blue and for that question. You're absolutely right to identify that dangerous boat crossings are something that no one would encourage, and that's something that our government and governments within the European Union need to find an answer to. While people arriving via irregular routes to the UK have become more visible in recent years, it's not the case that this is a new phenomenon. In fact, throughout our history, over centuries, people have arrived in the UK seeking sanctuary and fleeing oppression. And those that are doing so via small boats, but also via other means to the UK, whether by flying in or other routes, are no different. And it's really important, I think, that we hold on to that point and the fact that the UK has played a leading role over decades in ensuring internationally that people who are in desperate need have the right to claim asylum through our role in signing the Refugee Convention and also in our role signing up to the European Convention on Human Rights in the aftermath of the horrors of the Holocaust. Now,
Bella, just to say on that, I mean, some people will say, well, they're coming from France. France is not a dangerous country. You know, why are they seeking asylum from France? That's a question which is often posed. What's the response to that?
Again, thanks very much. An important question, because as you say, this is now formed part of a certain narrative. Something the Refugee Convention recognises, and I think that is incredibly important here, is that refugees are intended to have some agency in terms of where they choose to seek safety. And safety, in fact, is not an objective thing, it's highly subjective. So it might be safe for me to currently be on holiday here in France. But it's certainly not safe to be in France for some of the clients that my organisation has supported, who find themselves in immigration detention and who tell us about absolutely horrendous abuse that they faced in France, whether that's at police hands or from private actors. Depending on your nationality and the criminal networks that operate in different countries, you may be more or less safe. But one of the driving factors for many of the people we speak to is that they have family members here in the UK. They may have fled, some of the most horrendous situations that a human being can possibly experience. And when deciding where they want to go to try and rebuild their lives, sometimes they may have one surviving family member that's here in the UK. So the idea that you would begrudge somebody that and insist that they instead claim in Italy or Greece just because of an accident of how they happened to travel just doesn't really make sense from a logical perspective, from an agency perspective either. And it's certainly not the position in international law.
Okay, understood. I'm just going to bring in Alp now. So Alp, we've had, the Rwanda policy has been announced. It doesn't seem like the number of people making these journeys across the channel is reducing. So can we really say that the policy is being effective as a deterrent, which is presumably its prime intention?
Well, we don't know whether it's going to be a deterrent yet, because it hasn't actually effectively been put in place. We're waiting to hear what our Supreme Court says, and then if it again says that the policy is perfectly okay, as it has done already in respect of other concerning other individuals, then 3 weeks after that, it will be possible to fly people to Rwanda. But if I may go over a couple of things that Bella said, saying this was not a new phenomenon, and linking it to the overall claims for asylum by people coming over here. In fact, it is new. What we're talking about here is something very new. It started in 2018 with 299 people crossing the channel in boats. Last year it was 28,500. And already this year, we've had over 15,000, some 15,300 at 1.7 the rate we were having at this time last year. So by the end of the year, we're looking at another nearly 50,000 people crossing in this way. And that is what is being addressed, and that is what needs to be addressed. Criminals making money, people risking their lives, and in certain cases, we know, losing them. That's what's got to stop. And I think that the Rwanda policy is part of that picture. On its own, it won't solve the problem, but I think it can help.
So Alp, I mean, the early noughties, there were much higher numbers of people claiming asylum spontaneously. It has been rising, as you said, in recent years, but it's still not at the peak that it was in the noughties. What happened there? What brought down the number of cases?
Well, that was essentially the Balkan Wars. They threw out a lot of people who sought refuge in the way that is happening with Ukraine. It was a different sort of asylum claim at that time. And indeed, at that time in 2004, I think, Tony Blair came up with the idea that there would be third country processing. He put it to Brussels and got short shrift, even though the Germans were actually quite keen as well. So the idea of third country clearance, third country applications being processed is nothing new. I really don't see that. The difference, of course, is that at that time we were part of the EU. And I know people will go on to say, yes, but there was the Dublin Convention and now we can't send them back and we could then. Well, that's a nonsense, frankly, because the Dublin Convention worked very slowly. it applied over a period to very few people, and most of them were coming in our direction rather than going in the other direction.
Okay, let's bring in Maria. So I'm interested, Maria, in just public perceptions on this issue, because I know since the referendum in the EU, the salience of immigration generally has gone down, and there's lots of theories for why that might be. But this particular issue around asylum seekers coming spontaneously, making dangerous journeys, what's the sort of general public attitude on that? And where are we in terms of public approach to the Rwanda policy as well?
So I must say that the public opinion here is actually very difficult to measure, because we have measures that prompt people on the issue of immigration very frequently, and then they express all sorts of opinions that actually they wouldn't have spontaneously expressed. So what we see here is when people are asked about, do you like the sound of the Rwanda policy? Actually, quite a few people say, oh, yes, that sounds okay. That sounds like it should work. But when you actually ask them spontaneously to say what they care about, immigration is still extremely low. So we are looking at about a quarter of people volunteering immigration as an issue that is important. And they are absolutely dwarfed by the kinds of people who say health, still very high up, and of course, economy, which is now blowing everything else out of the water. So really what I think is relevant in the Rwanda policy debacle is not so much the public opinion per se, as the kind of core conservative vote, and even more importantly, right now in the current political situation, of course, the party members. And I think this is why we see leaders still committing and doubling on that policy, because they think it plays really well amongst those kind of core conservative voters and core members, the kind of traditional members who will vote, who are engaged. And this is a really risky approach for a political party, because, of course, these people really matter right now, and they will have huge impact on our politics because they will elect our next prime minister, in effect. But when that policy is taken to the wider electorate, I do think it will fall flat, because A, people don't really care about it that much, but also because it is so unproven. So when people say, oh, I generally support the Rwanda policy, they mean by this, it sounds fine if it works. But of course, so far it's not worked, and we don't know whether it's ever going to work. And the truth is that it's very reminiscent to this 2010 pledge that we've had from David Cameron about reducing immigration to tens of thousands. And this has done most damage to the Conservative Party out of all possible policy moves that they've done in recent decades. And I myself, in my book with Rob Ford, Brexitland, claimed that actually it was one of the big contributory factors to Brexit, because people have lost trust in the Conservative Party as the party that is competent on immigration. And I have just been looking actually at recent polling on the competency perceptions, and they have briefly recovered after Boris Johnson became Prime Minister, but they are down again now to what they were just after that disastrous 2010 pledge.
Okay.
And the London policy didn't do anything to improve it.
Okay, thank you, Maria. So Bella, I'm just going to bring you in again. So some people have sort of raised the issues around Rwanda and the safety and treatment of asylum seekers in Rwanda. And of course, a criticism of that is, well, that's quite derogatory towards Rwanda. Rwanda is now, thankfully, a more stable African country. So are we not, by criticizing this policy, also criticizing unfairly Rwanda as a stable country?
That's an important question. Thank you, Ryan. I think the first thing to say is that this policy is wrong, no matter where you send people. Every country that receives people fleeing persecution and seeking sanctuary should first look at their claim and process that claim before sending them anywhere, whether that's under the old Dublin system that Alp referred to, and I absolutely agree with him on that system was not fit for purpose, or whether it's sending people to Rwanda or wherever. So that's the main criticism here. But on Rwanda's record in particular, it's absolutely essential that the UK government and other governments calls out countries for where they have poor human rights records. And what we learnt from our court case last week and certain disclosures that we've now had from the Home Secretary, is that the UK's High Commissioner in Rwanda wrote in very strong terms to say that Rwanda should not be considered for this policy because of its human rights record. And that includes extrajudicial killings, torture, and the recruitment of refugees to serve in armed forces operations in neighbouring countries. So we have very clear evidence and a catalogue of it, actually, within the UK government, within the Foreign Office, within the Home Office, which says that Rwanda is not a country that should be considered for this kind of deal. And that is backed up with evidence. What that also says, what the disclosure also said, was that if Rwanda is pursued and a deal is done with Rwanda, then the UK government will necessarily have to change the way that it talks about Rwanda and Rwanda's human rights record. And I think that's what you've seen in the last few months. Essentially, the UK government now deciding to keep stum on Rwanda's human rights record. And that's deeply problematic and sets a really concerning precedent. But the government that's at fault here is the UK government. It's the UK government that has pursued this deal. It would seem that Rwanda is the only country that has put its hand up. And so the UK government has gone with Rwanda against official advice across the board.
Thank you, Beth. So just back to you, Alp. So my understanding from Migration Watch's position is that you're concerned primarily with the level of immigration into the UK. So I'm interested in whether actually, if we just processed asylum claims quicker onshore rather than offshore, say in Rwanda, and actually a lot of the people who were claiming were processed quickly, and if they were found not to have a legitimate asylum claim, to be removed quickly. Is that not surely the best solution here, just improving our processing here in the UK and deporting people if they're found not to have been granted asylum correctly, to deport them much more quickly? Surely that is a way of controlling migration in the sort of most cost-efficient way.
Well, firstly, Ryan, can we please separate illegal migration, which is what setting off in a rickety boat from an unauthorized point in France to cross the channel in dangerous circumstances? Of course it's illegal. No one can
I disagree with that because
legal.
I don't think it's illegal to claim asylum. I think it's illegal to stay in the country if your asylum
No. Sorry, Ryan. I'm going before that. Of course it's illegal in international law to set off in an unsafe vessel from a point which is unauthorized. But that separately, the fact is that most people do actually regard it as illegal migration. Yes, I agree entirely with the fact that it should all be done more quickly. And that is one of the problems, that it takes so long. There are reasons for that, but 6 months is the target date now. I think Rishi Sunak has mentioned it, as Priti Patel in her latest paper, a new plan for immigration. She has also committed to 6 months. That's not good enough, frankly. We simply cannot hang on to people for 6 months and then maybe not make a decision, which is what's happening. However, even more importantly, I think, is that you said those who are refused, the turned down, should be removed. The fact is that just doesn't happen. With regards to Rwanda, if I can just go back to the suitability of Rwanda, look, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees has been involved in relocating 30,000 Burundians to Rwanda. Hundreds of people from Libyan camps have been relocated to Rwanda. So it's fine for them, but not for those for whom we have actually gone to a great deal of trouble to make appropriate arrangements for. And with Rwanda, surely to goodness, if we are influencing their human rights performance by getting in place an arrangement which is going to mean that not just us, but the world is going to have their eyes on the fact that Rwanda is doing this. That too is helping, I would argue, Rwanda get its act together, and indeed helping them develop in the way that we should be doing. As for other safe countries, the EU, for goodness sake, is paying huge amounts of money to Turkey, effectively to be a safe third country. Bella just referred to France as being an atrocious place, and why some people are fleeing there and not necessarily fleeing from wherever else they have come from. So really, what this policy is doing is actually helping that whole process of everyone trying to behave as they should with regard to human rights.
Thank you, Alp. Right, let's bring in Maria, because I'm conscious of time, and we've got some more questions. We've got lots of questions coming in from the audience. Just to remind you that you can do that through Slido, and the code to ask questions is BBTV. But we have William from Lincolnshire, who asks, surely people smuggling from the EU can only be properly solved by an EU-UK agreement on asylum cooperation. Rwanda seems a costly dead-end distraction. Maria, thoughts on that?
Yes, I agree. And I think this is a real problem that we have faced in many areas, but asylum seeking is definitely one of those areas that post-Brexit negotiations, which were not really conducted in good faith from the point of view of the EU, on the British side, that kind of goodwill to help us out with various things, and asylum seeking, as I say, is just one example of this, is very thin on the ground. And so what we do need to go, when we think about third country processing, what we really mean is countries where those asylum seekers are. And so Rwanda is not really a bona fide third country in this meaning, because they are not there. We want to put them there, and that just adds the, as you say in a question, additional costs and complications, and of course the legal challenges. So the example of Turkey is slightly different, because a lot of those refugees were already in Turkey, and Turkey just acts as a country where they can be processed instead of passing them on. And so what we really do need to do is we need to talk to France much more constructively about processing people who are already in those clay camps, rather than allow them to make this horrible journey, very dangerous, deathly journey here, and then send them back to Rwanda. Because frankly, if they're risking their lives to cross the channel, they're not going to care so much about Rwanda, are they? They're already risking absolutely everything making that journey.
Great. So I'm going to direct the next question to Bella. So we have an anonymous person saying the Syrian resettlement program helped people from near a crisis without the need for the dangerous survival of the fittest journey. Should that be a model here? And I think, you know, this draws on a question I had as well, which is, are there alternatives to this Rwanda scheme for stopping people making these dangerous journeys? One is obviously this idea of increasing resettlement routes, or the numbers coming through resettlement routes. Is that something you would agree with, Bella? Is there more other options we could be looking at?
I think that's a good question. And I think resettlement is obviously important and schemes need to be expanded. But worldwide, resettlement will only ever account for quite a small proportion of refugee solutions. And one of the things we need to hold on to is that when people need to flee, as we've seen recently in Afghanistan, very visibly, as we've seen recently in Ukraine, very visibly, the idea of them then entering a long and bureaucratic resettlement program is not going to be the right answer for a lot of people. And just as we saw such huge public support for bringing Ukrainians over and having Ukrainians stay in people's homes, you know, people fleeing from Syria right now are also fleeing Putin's bombs, but they don't have that scheme available to them. And that's why you see so many Syrians, for example, risking their lives in the Channel right now. So there needs to be a better response that can be swifter and more effective for people than resettlement. And what we think that looks like is the ability for entry clearance to be given to people that have very real and very immediate needs, so that there is a safe passage, a safe route for them to reach the UK. And it's those routes that have really been closed down in recent years. And that's certainly contributing to the spike in visible arrivals on the channel, because previously people had other routes available to them, or people were taking other irregular routes, such as stowing away on lorries. So there desperately does need to be alternatives, Ryan, but resettlement can never be the whole answer to that.
Okay, good. So Alp, a question that's directed to you, which is, you said the deterrence effect cannot be known until flights have taken off. Should the government know if a policy will be effective before it implements it?
Well, if the government is saying part of the reason of having this scheme in place is to deter people from setting off from the other side of the channel, then frankly, until it starts, it rolls into action, we just don't know. But at this point, I think the government believes that it will have a deterrent effect. Time will tell whether it does.
But Alp, the government announced the Rwanda scheme in April. Asylum seekers were not to know that the European Court of Human Rights was going to stop the planes taking off. So there was a risk for many people from April that they could go to Rwanda. And it doesn't seem that that has led to a reduction in the number of people making dangerous crossings.
Well, the fact is that there's no evidence to suggest that anyone will be flown to Rwanda yet. And the traffickers, they've only recently been marketing their services with people about to be picked up by one of our border force vessels. So the fact is that at the moment, the message is not actually getting out that there is going to be such a scheme in place. But very importantly, going back to what Bella said about alternative schemes for getting people here, the problem with actually suddenly saying, yes, everyone can come and we will take you all in, as the Scots have discovered, it's really so difficult. If you're going to have proper arrangements, you can't simply say to people, yes, you're welcome, cross our border. The Scots found that they committed to this super Ukraine scheme for affording shelter to people fleeing Putin's bombs. They've had to put it on hold because they've run out of housing, for goodness sake. And this is the problem, as so often it's happened with the Afghan resettlement scheme as well. There is much and so much more to settling people, relocating people, than simply saying to them, come in. And that's something that very often is forgotten.
Okay.
Can I just come in here?
Yeah,
Sorry.
Maria, please go ahead.
Ask the question. Do you not think that, given how expensive this Rwanda policy already has proven to be and is forecast to be, could we not put that money into those resettlement deals? Could we not change the law to allow people awaiting their status decisions to work, for example? Would that not be other ways, and cheaper ways, in fact, to improve our asylum system? All the money that we are currently spending on
I'm not sure that the money we're spending on Rwanda, 120 million, is actually preventing us from devoting the resources necessary for those that are properly resettled. I really don't see that the way we're proposing to help Rwanda get its act in order and help people to settle there and to really build on whatever it is that we are offering them. I see that as a win-win situation, frankly. And people in this country, I'm afraid, would say you're giving 120 million, and in fact, they already do say, there are those who argue that perhaps that 120 million pounds for housing or whatever could be devoted to housing our people in this country.
Well, quite right. The use of 120 million pounds of public money which has gone, whether or not anyone ever goes to Rwanda, is deeply, deeply irresponsible. And I would argue what's quite striking about this policy is how deeply unconservative it is. Vast sums of public money are being poured into a project where, on the numbers that we've seen, the government's not even proposing to be able to remove very many people, and seems to know that it won't be able to do so. And actually, if you look at the roots of a policy like this, it was in the 1980s that the National Front campaigned to pull the UK out of the Refugee Convention, which is in effect what this policy would do. It would completely outsource our Refugee Convention obligations in a way that essentially undermines it and could trigger the unraveling of the international humanitarian protection system worldwide. And the National Front also campaigned to repatriate Black people to Africa. And that's really where you can sort of trace the lineage of this policy. It's not a conservative policy, but I think it's quite striking that this is now being championed by the two remaining leadership candidates. And I think, as Maria was referring to, this isn't even something that is commanding huge public support. There's no mandate. This was not in the manifesto that the Conservatives put forward in 2019. And for a policy that is going to have such far-reaching implications if it is enacted, you would expect that there would need to be a manifesto commitment for this. In fact, every electoral test that this policy has so far had, which is thus far the local elections in May and 2 by-elections, has not seen the Conservative Party doing particularly well. So again, you just have to question where this is coming from and why, and is it all
great.
really
Thank
just
you.
I'm sorry, Ryan. I'm sorry, but
conscious
I've got
of
to
time.
come in on that.
No. But let me. I'm conscious of time, Alp, so I am going to have to bring this to an end.
I'm sorry, but
So
I am
I'd be
conscious of
grateful
time
if
as
you could
well.
just let me bring it to an end. So
No,
basically,
I am
now coming to the end of time. I would question Bella's.
That is an unfair point to end on, Ryan. I'm sorry.
Okay, but I'm asking you all a question, Alp. So I disagree with Bella's view of the intention of the policy. I think the intention is benign, which is to try and stop the journeys, the dangerous journeys coming across the channel. I would dispute the idea that it sort of has racist motivations.
Thank you.
But I do question the efficacy of the policy. So let's ask a question to all three of you, which is, imagine that the flights never take off, so it never happens, or imagine a year from now, Alp, we have evidence that it isn't deterring people from coming across the channel. Very quickly and very briefly, if not Rwanda, what else would you do? One thing you would do to try and reduce the dangerous journeys. So we'll start with Maria.
I mean, this might be unrealistic, but I really would encourage our government to work much more closely with France and try to process people where they are currently. I think that's the safest way.
Thank you. Alp?
I agree. We should be working closely with France. I don't think it's realistic to think that we can set up application points in embassies around Europe. They'll be overrun within days. If we deal with people quickly, and those who don't qualify should be returned and are returned quickly, then I think that will have an impact. At the moment, we're not removing anyone. That's the problem.
Bella?
To bring down boat crossings, we need an entry clearance system which would allow those that have, on the face of it, a claim for asylum that they could pursue in the UK to be able to come here and to pursue that claim. That could really deal with the business model of the smugglers overnight if it was enacted. And as part of that effort, we also need to work European-wide to ensure that there is a rebalancing so that it's not just those states in Southern Europe that are disproportionately receiving asylum seekers, but that people are able to choose which country that they want to go to and to be able to get there to then make their claim. I think one thing we need to challenge is this idea that everyone is trying to come to the UK. And I sense from some of Alp's comments that's an idea that's in the background. Actually, if you look at the numbers of where people direct themselves to within Europe, the UK is really low down on the pecking order, because obviously
Okay.
other European countries have large communities and places that people are trying to get
Thank
to.
you, Bella. Right, we must end there, but thank you very much. We ran over time, but thank you to all three of you. Very grateful for your time and your thoughts. A kind of virtual round of applause to Alp, Maria and Bella. It got increasingly heated towards the end. It is obviously a very important and often quite emotional subject, but I hope people watching learnt a lot and have a good afternoon. Thank you very much.